Margaret of Baton Rouge, an enslaved woman purchased for $1,200 in 1853, entered the Beaumont plantation not as wife or mother, but as property. Her name was inked into the ledger like livestock. Yet, unlike field hands, she was placed in the house, tasked with raising the Beaumont heirs. By 1856, she became not their nursemaid, but their executioner. The house loomed over the Mississippi night, a monument to sugar and cruelty. Chandeliers swayed faintly, velvet curtains sealed out the moon. 3 boys lay beneath embroidered blankets, their breaths shallow in sleep. Unaware of the figure in the doorway, Margaret stood framed in shadows, a rope hidden in her apron. For years she had rocked these boys, kissed their brows, soothed their cries. Tonight she chose to silence them. Every humiliation, every child stolen, every wound carved by whip and word, gathered now in her gaze. She did not tremble. She carried the calm of a verdict. Thomas 8 curled against the wall. James 6 clutched a toy horse. William 4 slept soft with innocence. The rope was more than a weapon, it was a sentence. Margaret's fingers brushed it like an old companion, its fibers promising closure denied to her when her own sons were sold. The room held its breath. Outside, the plantation slept. Inside, inevitability thickened. Margaret had been bought to preserve a family's line. Tonight she resolved to end it. Her silhouette against the fading fire became vengeance itself. Beaumont Plantation sprawled across 3,000 acres, an empire carved from cane and cruelty. The mill belched smoke as men fed iron rollers with blistered hands. Sugar was Louisiana's gold, but every pound carried the bitterness of stolen labor. The mansion declared wealth with white pillars, velvet drapes, silver and portraits, yet beneath the glitter lay misery. Ledgers reduced lives to numbers. Margaret's name was written as satisfactory purchase. She was not listed as a mother, only as property. The plantation's beauty concealed its brutality. Polished wood and lavender oil upstairs, chains and hunger in the quarters. Guests praised refinement, but every chandelier gleamed brighter because lives had been dimmed. To outsiders, Beaumont was elegance. To the enslaved, it was a cage. Even the air betrayed the truth. Cane's sweetness carried the acrid smoke of the mill. Cicadas droned ceaselessly, echoing the endless cycle of labor. Here Margaret walked daily, her presence a reminder that wealth rested on her grief. Her vengeance was not sudden. It was born the day her twin sons, Samuel and Isaiah, were torn away. For 7 years they clung to her skirts. Then, without mercy, they were sold, carried off in a wagon while she watched from the window. Samuel pressed his hands through the slats. Isaiah cried until his voice broke. That fading sound became an echo she could never escape. Every night she heard it again, the scrape of wood, the breaking plea. It hardened her. What began as grief transformed into steel. Her quarters were barren, a narrow room behind the kitchen. Nothing belonged to her but silence. Upstairs, the nursery rang with laughter that wasn't hers. She soothed children who replaced her own, each lullaby a betrayal. Her composure fooled the Beaumont. They saw duty, not torment. But each smile she forced deepened the hollow. Downstairs, she lived with damp walls and hunger. Upstairs, boys wasted food from porcelain bowls. Each careless crumb was a reminder of enslaved children starving in the quarters. The Beaumont heirs reflected their father's legacy. Thomas already carried arrogance, casual in cruelty. James was quiet but deliberate in malice. Only William, 4, remained innocent, still trusting. Margaret's tenderness toward them was forced, every gesture haunted by Samuel and Isaiah's absence. Her lullabies changed. Once warm, they became vows, each note a promise whispered into the dark. Samuel, Isaiah, the names never left her lips. They became the compass that guided her heart, the fire that lit her nights. What was taken could not be forgiven. The Beaumonts believed themselves insulated by wealth. They did not see what they had created, a woman whose grief had fused with resolve. By tearing away her sons, they had planted seeds of vengeance that no lash could kill. And in October of 1856, in the nursery beneath the dim chandelier, Margaret answered that debt. Her duties stretched from dawn until nightfall. She washed their faces, combed their hair, corrected their posture. She taught them letters with chalk and slate, remembering Samuel tracing letters in dust before he was sold. The contrast was unbearable. Her own sons denied the future she prepared for. Another woman's bloodline. Thomas mimicked his father, Edmund Beaumont. He kicked at servants who passed too close. He struck dogs for amusement. Cruelty was casual, effortless. James, though younger, was quieter, sharper, pinching, taunting, whispering lies to see others punished. William, at 4, still clutched Margaret's skirt, offering flowers and laughter. Yet innocence in Beaumont walls was fragile. Time would curdle him too. At night, Margaret tucked them into feather beds beneath embroidered quilts. She hummed lullabies once sung to Samuel and Isaiah in a bare cabin. For the Beaumont heirs, her songs were comfort. For her, torture a reminder of voices she would never hear again. Each act of care deepened her wound. Dressing them recalled nakedness. Feeding them recalled hunger. Teaching them recalled silence. Every gesture was theft repeated, salt rubbed into the scar of her loss. The boys were children, yet also symbols. Thomas's cruelty, James's malice, William's fleeting innocence. They were the future Beaumont men in miniature. Games rehearsed domination. Margaret felt fury spark each time small hands struck or mocked. Cruelty, even childish, carried inheritance. The nursery became unbearable. It was no longer duty, it was foreshadowing. Margaret's grief forced a wake. Between lullabies and lessons, her resolve hardened. Her silence was ending. Margaret, a house servant at Beaumont Plantation near Baton Rouge, who would strangle the master's children in October of 1856. By September's end, grief had hardened into destiny. She noticed rhythms. Edmund Beaumont lingering with whiskey, servants retiring, the nursery softening into silence, Starmus restless, James twitching, William surrendering to slumber. Each beat of the night carried a signal. Power thrived on order. She turned that order back upon itself. Routine became a map. Rage was fire. She needed something colder. Calculation steadied her hand. Patience became her weapon. Each night she folded observation into memory. Mrs. Beaumont, heavy with pregnancy, retired early. Margaret measured the boys' cycles of sleep. Thomas resisted, James drifted slow, William succumbed quickly. The house itself taught her when silence ripened in her quarters. She traced the sequence in thought. Creak of stairs, narrow hall, nursery door sighing shut, floorboards that betrayed footsteps, hinges that groaned, rope hidden in her apron. Each detail rehearsed, she moved with obedience. but inside built a design none could see. Not impulse, but architecture. The scale, tilted against her for years, would bend back. Patience stretched through weeks. She hummed lullabies steady while her heart marked time. By late September, she ceased to wonder if she would act. Only when silence became her ally. The nursery, adorned with quilts and gilded frames, transformed in her vision, its laughter destined to fade into stillness. Each night she stood in the doorway, rope hidden, feeling inevitability. By September's close, the plan was complete. Grief aligned with patience, patience with calculation. The nursery would not remain innocent. It would be a mausoleum. Don't keep this darkness to yourself. Share this story. Let another soul feel the weight of Margaret's shadow. On October 15th, the household settled into silence. Edmund drank late. Mrs. Beaumont had retired. Servants slept. Only the nursery waited. At 10:37, Thomas stirred. His eyes opened. The rope tightened before his cry could rise. He clawed, but Margaret's grip did not waver. His gasps cut short. His body sagged. James shifted, sensing absence. Margaret moved swiftly. The rope fell. He thrashed, eyes wide with terror beyond his years. Her patience had hardened into iron. His tremors faded. William blinked awake, whispered, "Mama Margaret." He knew her as comfort. Confusion softened his face. She hummed a lullaby once sung to Samuel and Isaiah. His chest rose and fell, then stilled. The nursery lay transformed. 3 beds, 3 bodies, airs silenced. Margaret stood in the doorway, rope loose, face unchanged. Outside, seek others young. Inside, the world had shifted. She returned to her quarters. Rope coiled, body weary, heart stilled. For the first time since her sons were sold, sleep came without torment. By dawn, the Beaumont name would stand over coffins, not cradles. Margaret rested as vengeance complete. At dawn, the upstairs maid entered the nursery and froze. 3 lifeless bodies lay beneath pale morning light. Her cry tore through the halls. Servants rushed. Voices collided. Within minutes, terror consumed the house. Doctors were summoned. Dr. Rousseau of Natchez examined them. Thomas, limp but unmarked. James, fists clenched. William, serene, no marks, no bruises, no poison. It was as though death itself had walked silently in and left without trace. The Beaumonts collapsed. Catherine fainted in that. Edmund in New Orleans. Their empire shook. Servants whispered curses. Neighbors gathered. Margaret played her role with perfection. She pressed a handkerchief to trembling lips. She wept with convincing grief. Visitors called her Poor Margaret, praising devotion. She accepted sympathy with bowed head. Not one voice doubted her. Whispers spread among the enslaved. Some called it a curse. Others divine judgment. White neighbors echoed superstition. How else could heirs vanish untouched? Margaret let whispers live. They shielded her. Her morning performance deflected suspicion toward the supernatural dot. At night the plantation was cloaked in fear. Mothers clutched children tighter. Servants crossed themselves at doors. Margaret sat among them, her face streaked with believable sorrow, her eyes lowered in prayer. No one dared imagine the hands that killed had also soothed. By the next sunrise, Margaret's mask was secure. She had woven herself into the grief of the house, untouchable, a figure of sympathy rather than suspicion. And so, in the very heart of chaos, she moved unseen, shielded by the art of deception and the blindness of belief. Her vengeance demanded more. The children's deaths had shattered the estate, but one figure still stood at its center: Catherine Beaumont, the widowed matriarch, heavy with child and drowning in guilt. Margaret turned her gaze upon her next target. This act would not be sudden. It would not be violent. It would be slow, deliberate, wrapped in care. She chose foxglove, a plant known on the plantation grounds, lethal in the wrong dose, yet trusted in small measures as medicine. Margaret ground its leaves into a powder fine enough to vanish in steam. She stirred it into teas, presenting them not as weapons, but as offerings of healing. Catherine, frail from grief and weakened by pregnancy, embraced those offerings. She saw Margaret not as servant, but as companion, the only soul who seemed to share her endless sorrow. Day by day she leaned more heavily on her nursemaid's presence, whispering thanks for the steady hands that tended her. She had no reason to question the warmth in Margaret's eyes, or the steady calm with which each cup of tea was delivered. The poison worked with merciless precision. Catherine's heart, already strained, began to falter. Her breath shortened, her body swelled, her steps grew uncertain. Neighbors whispered that sorrow was consuming her. Some said she walked like a ghost even while alive. Margaret stayed near, arranging pillows, pressing cool cloths to Catherine's forehead, ensuring the deception remained flawless. By early autumn, Catherine's decline was unmistakable. Her hands trembled when she wrote, her lips paled, her pulse thinned. Yet she continued to confide in Margaret, speaking of regrets, of her failure to protect her children, of the shadow of loss that clung to every room. Margaret listened, nodding softly, concealing the satisfaction that grew with each passing week. One evening, as the sun faded behind the cypress trees, Catherine sat at her writing desk. Her body quivered with exhaustion, yet she forced her hand across the paper. She wrote words of gratitude. Gratitude to Margaret, who she believed had been her anchor through storms of grief. The ink bled faintly where her hand lost control, her letters slanting into fragments. Then, in mid-sentence, the pen slipped. Catherine fell forward, breath gone, her heart finally silenced by the poison that had pulsed through her veins. Dr. Rousseau was summoned once more. He examined the body, finding no sign of foul play. To him, the explanation was simple. A widow's grief, compounded by pregnancy, had drained her until nothing remained. He declared death by melancholia, the slow suffocation of sorrow. The neighbors believed him. To the Beaumont circle, Catherine's passing was inevitable, a tragedy written by fate. But beneath that accepted story lay Margaret's most calculated murder. Unlike the children's swift strangulation, Catherine's death was stretched across weeks, a form of warfare both psychological and botanical. Each sip of tea was another step toward the grave. Each word of comfort was another layer of deception. Catherine's faith in Margaret became the very tool of her destruction. With Catherine gone, the last matriarch of Beaumont was extinguished. The plantation stood hollow, its lineage fractured, its legacy poisoned from within. Margaret had executed her vengeance with the patience of a surgeon and the precision of a strategist. The woman who had once embodied Beaumont's grace died believing she was loved, never knowing that love had been a mask worn by the hand that killed her. Catherine Beaumont lay buried. Debts were crushing the estate, and the empire of sugar and chandeliers began to collapse. Yet even in its ruin, the Beaumont dynasty tried to hold its veneer of wealth intact. The plantation was prepared for auction. Notices were printed in Natchez papers, promising land, livestock, furniture, and human property to anyone with coin or credit. 3,000 acres of sugarcane would go under the hammer. Persian rugs, carved mahogany chairs, and silver imported from London would be displayed for bidders. And among the lists, in careful handwriting, stood the name of Margaret. She was Lot 17, valued for her skills, her obedience, her good health, a body catalogued like furniture, her life reduced to a line of ink. The irony was as sharp as it was cruel. Margaret, who had already dismantled the Beaumont bloodline from within, was now prepared for sale like any other item salvaged from the wreckage. The chandeliers were tarnished, the ledgers filled with red ink. Yet it was still human flesh that promised the fastest profit. She was to be sold into another house, another chain of bondage, another nursery, perhaps, where new masters would trust her hands. But fate had other designs. The first buyer to express interest was Judge Thibodeau, a man with deep pockets and darker appetites. He had purchased slaves before, priding himself on breaking the spirit of those brought to his land. On the eve of signing papers, the judge collapsed during supper, clutching at his chest. Doctors pronounced it a sudden failure of the heart. Some whispered of stress, some of indulgence. Others, remembering Margaret's reputation for herbs and roots, began to murmur that she had reached beyond the boundaries of Beaumont itself. Then came the Rocher son, a planter from St. Francisville, young, proud, careless with money. He fancied Margaret as both servant and possession. Days before the auction, his body was found cold in his bed. Physicians searched for explanation. No wound, no fever, no clear cause. The silence of medicine only fed the rising dread. One after another, names linked to the purchase of Lot 17 fell away. Potential buyers grew cautious, some withdrawing altogether, refusing even to ride past the gates of Beaumont Plantation. Fear moved faster than the auctioneer's hand. Whispers wound through taverns, churches, and markets. Margaret was untouchable. To buy her was to invite death into one's house. By September, the Beaumont auction became a spectacle of hesitation. The land sold in parcels, the furniture hauled away in wagons, the sugar mill purchased by an ambitious merchant. But Margaret's lot remained unclaimed. The gavel struck air, and no one raised a hand. The ledger that once promised her sale remained incomplete, the ink unfinished. For the first time, the market recoiled, not out of pity, but out of terror. Captain Morrison, a man hired to enforce order, was sent to retrieve her. He had a record of tracking fugitives, his reputation built on returning runaways, broken and chained. But when he arrived at Beaumont, Margaret was already gone. No slave saw her leave. No overseer could explain. Her room stood empty, its cot stripped bare, its floor swept clean. She had vanished into shadow. Some said she took the swamp routes at night, guided by hidden hands along the Underground Railroad. Others swore she poisoned her pursuers before slipping northward. Stories conflicted, but the fact was certain. Margaret escaped the auction block that was meant to erase her. She transformed from property into fugitive, from fugitive into symbol. Her legend did not fade. Instead, it grew sharper, darker. Reports surfaced across parishes of sudden deaths linked to her shadow. An abolitionist in Baton Rouge collapsed after tea brewed by an unknown hand. A slave catcher in Opelousas, returning from a hunt, never woke after his evening meal. A planter near Vicksburg fell ill after dismissing a woman rumored to have known Margaret. Each incident fed the fire of her myth. Whether she was truly there or whether her name alone inspired fear mattered little. Margaret became both person and phantom. To the enslaved, she was proof that rebellion could strike in silence, that knowledge itself could be a weapon. To masters, she was a reminder that no house was safe, no nursery secure, no teacup innocent dot in cabins across Louisiana and Mississippi. Her story was told in whispers. Mothers repeated her name to daughters as they taught them herbs and roots, half in warning, half in admiration. Fathers spoke of her when the night grew long, recounting how a woman once turned grief into fire. To children, she was the figure who proved that bondage did not erase agency, that even one body catalogued as property could dismantle dynasties. The Beaumont collapse became a parable. The grand house, once glittering with chandeliers, now echoed with emptiness. Weeds choked the paths where carriages once rolled. The nursery where Margaret had once sung lullabies became a chamber of silence. Visitors said it felt haunted, not by ghosts alone, but by the weight of what had happened inside its walls. Yet Margaret herself remained unseen. Captain Morrison scoured the countryside, his dogs tracking scents that dissolved in swamps and forests. He interrogated those suspected of helping her, but no confession came. Some believed she boarded a riverboat under disguise, carried into Ohio territory and onward to freedom. Others insisted she never left Louisiana, living in the shadows. A silent hand in every unexplained death. In the absence of certainty, myth flourished. Planters warned one another not to speak her name aloud, fearing it would summon her. Preachers used her tale as caution, painting her as devil's handmaid. But in secret corners, abolitionist circles elevated her to symbol. To them, Margaret was not demon but deliverer, a woman who proved that knowledge and patience could destabilize empire more thoroughly than armies. Her legend crossed borders. In New Orleans, sailors spoke of her while drinking in dockside taverns. In Ohio, fugitives carried her story northward, embellishing details until she became larger than life. In Baton Rouge, townspeople swore they heard her footsteps near the Beaumont ruins, smelled bitter herbs burning on nights when no wind stirred. Margaret became a contradiction embodied. To masters, she was a nightmare with no face. To the enslaved, she was a beacon cloaked in shadow. To abolitionists, she was living evidence that resistance could spring from the very kitchens of oppression. By the time Beaumont's lands were divided, the dynasty had dissolved. Its heirs lay buried, its matriarch poisoned, its patriarch ruined by debt and despair. And in that collapse, Margaret's absence rang louder than any presence. She was no longer Lot 17. She was not a line of ink in a ledger. She was a legend, unbound, untethered, unstoppable. Even now, her shadow lingers. Some say her story echoes in the wind that bends cane fields. Others claim her legend is carried in the songs of those who sought freedom along hidden routes. And in Baton Rouge, where the Beaumont house still stands abandoned, there are whispers of children's voices at night, and the scent of herbs no gardener planted. Margaret, the nursemaid of Beaumont Plantation, who turned nursery into tomb and auction into disappearance, did not simply escape. She transformed grief into rebellion, and rebellion into legend. Margaret, the nursemaid of Beaumont Plantation in Natchez, who strangled 3 heirs and poisoned their mother, became more than a fugitive. She became a legend, a figure whose shadow stretched across the South and ignited whispers in the North. Her name carried weight, sharpened by fear in planter households and polished into fire among those who dreamed of freedom. What began as one woman's grief hardened into a mythology that outlived her. Her knowledge of plants, once used to heal, was now remembered as a weapon. Within enslaved quarters, women passed down her methods in secret. Leaves, roots, and seeds were catalogued not as cures, but as instruments of power. These were the blood lessons, folk remedies layered with warnings, encoded with possibility. To the enslaved, Margaret was a teacher. To masters, she was a ghost who might be hiding in every kitchen. Plantation owners felt it. Their paranoia grew. Every cup of tea was suspect. Every bowl of broth was tested with suspicion. Men who once trusted nursemaids with their children now watched them with unease. Mothers, pregnant and weary, wondered if the hands that rocked their cradles might also close around their throats. Margaret had shifted the balance of intimacy. No longer was care free of danger. She became a mirror, reflecting the rot of the system back onto those who built it. Some branded her a demon, a servant of darkness, proof that slavery bred monsters within its walls. Others, abolitionists, storytellers, and those enslaved who longed for escape, carried her name as proof of resistance. In the shadows of cabins and at the edges of fields, her story moved from a whispered tale to a weapon of its own. Generations carried her legend forward. To the children of the enslaved, Margaret was a warning that grief could turn into fire. To their grandchildren, she was evidence that even the powerless could strike terror into the heart of empire. To their great-grandchildren, she became folklore woven into hymns, chants, and bedtime stories that carried both fear and hope. Meanwhile, history itself confirmed what rumor had long said. Forensic evidence, unearthed from records and examined by later generations, showed patterns of poisoning consistent with her methods. Bodies had no marks. Organs revealed traces of foxglove and other herbs known only to those who studied quietly in kitchens. What had once been dismissed as curses and coincidence gained a harder truth. Margaret's hand could still be read in the chemical scars left behind. If her legend unsettled you, know this: there are countless more buried in silence. Subscribe, and we will unearth them together. Yet her fate remained untold. Some believed she moved north, carried through the Underground Railroad into a new life. Others insisted she continued her shadowed war in Louisiana, drifting from estate to estate, unseen but never forgotten. In Baton Rouge, where the Beaumont house still stands, locals whisper of children's voices echoing through empty halls. Visitors claim to smell strange herbs, bitter and sharp, as though brewed in kitchens long abandoned. That house became a monument to what Margaret had done, not through statues, not through books, but through fear that refused to loosen its grip. To walk its halls was to feel the presence of a mother who had rewritten the story of bondage with her own hand. To hear the whispers there was to know that empire itself could be destabilized by the patience of one woman, armed not with armies, but with knowledge, grief, and resolve. Margaret's story is not a simple tale of revenge. It is a reckoning. A mother avenged her sons, and in doing so, forced the South to face its own reflection. She left behind no grave, no confirmed end, only a legend suspended between terror and inspiration. Asterisk, so stay with us. Subscribe, because the next story may enter you even deeper, and remind you that history never truly dies for some. She remains the spectre of betrayal, a servant who turned love into death. For others, She is a mother who refused to let injustice stand unpunished, a woman who transformed her sorrow into defiance. Whether demon or heroine, Margaret destabilized more than one family. She unsettled an entire world that had believed itself unshakable. Her name still lingers, not written in stone, but carried in voices, in stories, in the unease of those who recall her. Margaret of Beaumont, the nursemaid who turned nursery into tomb, who turned tea into poison, who turned grief into rebellion. A vanished slave whose legend endures as both warning and promise.